Hello and welcome to Boston Media Theory. My name's Marcus Breen, and this is the first in a series of discussions about media theory by people who live in Boston and who work in Boston. The idea of the program is to give our guests an opportunity to talk about the work that they've been doing and how it informs their either activism or their continuing research. I'm delighted to say that our first guest today is Charlotte Ryan from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you.
I want to start by asking you about your career trajectory and how you came to be involved in media theory and media and communication generally.
It wasn't a direct path. I started out as a child of union activists in Lowell, Massachusetts, not far from here, although my family had been in the Boston area for a long, long time. And I went to Harvard during the 1960s. I was scholarship to Harvard and found myself in the middle of not only the civil rights movement, but the student anti-war movement and the women's movement all breaking open around me. So I became very active in a number of social movements, all of which were trying to figure out how to communicate effectively beyond the converted core. And we're really in mixed degrees, either highly successful or successful temporarily, or not very successful, getting beyond a convinced few. So that's had me start thinking about sort of it was especially stark for me because I would leave Harvard Square where people were debating, different factions of SDS were debating about which buildings to take or which ways to go, about whether one should be going into the factories and sort of trying to change the United States from within, or one should be just opposing international interventions. So there'd be these massive debates, and I would literally get on a train, drive, ride 45 minutes, and be home with a family that was waiting for the protesters to arrive in Lowell because they were going to beat the hell out of them.
Right.
So that, for me, the idea that we had not convinced America yet that there was something wrong with what was going on in the United States and what the United States was doing potentially in other parts of the world, it was very clear to me we hadn't gotten very far.
Right.
I mean, we had gotten a 20-minute, cab ride maybe, but we hadn't even gotten a 35-minute train ride out of the mecca of political unrest. So
Right.
I became aware of the need to really learn to communicate. When I graduated, I won a Rockefeller Traveling Fellowship to go to Latin America, and I chose to go to Chile just as the Popular Unity government was starting. And I got an unpaid job working in the communications section of the Ministry of Agriculture, where
Right.
I became a female vocalist for Kuruvun, which was trying to figure out how you used popular theater and popular music to
Right.
talk about land reform.
So this is well before what we now call new media or the internet.
This
So this is really basic communication, singing
this is basic communication.
for a revolution, as it were, a democratically elected government in Chile.
Absolutely, and people were writing the theater, and people were writing the songs to sing along with the folk ballet, and the ministries were all trying to figure out how they developed broader education plans. And for the first time, I saw our government actually thinking about having a press and publishing books for educational purposes and publishing newspapers and cartoons and thinking about popular sort of mass communication. And there were a number of European theorists, Michel Matalat was there, who were helping think communication as not simply as the tail sort of mechanism on the end of a social movement, but communication as the whole way that communication as the center of a social movement became. I lived with that,
Right.
so that I really and I lived with it on every level, where I saw, sort of different factions of different political parties all arguing in the cafeteria at the Universidad Católica, at the Catholic University, or getting on a train to be a translator for a visiting U.S. journalist, and walking into a Plaza de Armas, a little town square, somewhere along the long Chilean corridor, where we'd be brought out to a land reform. And what mattered was not only that we capture the politics of the situation, but that we could actually walk in and knew how to conduct ourselves as people who respect other people, so that everything from interpersonal communication through clear writing, through producing written words. I mean, the Xerox machines were not easily available, so if I was part of a North American group of progressives who wanted to simply translate U.S. news into Spanish to get fuller access for the Chilean parties. And we would translate the New York Times on Attica, the prison riots, or translate a New Yorker special on a social problem in the United States, translate from English into Spanish. And then if we were going to make it available to the ministries, we literally would type it multiple times onto a Mimeo, and when that Mimeo wore out after 400 copies, we would type the entire thing again. So in 1973, that was the technology that was available, as well as radio, which was absolutely phenomenal.
Right, so in a really highly charged environment, the media and communication technologies at every level really kicked in.
And the government recognized it as a central, not only a central mechanism that was necessary, a central tool, but as the living soul of what was happening. That the connective tissue was living. It wasn't simply a wire that goes from one living important thing to another living important thing. It was alive, and how it was done mattered. And that was, for me, that was just, and to see people living a conscious sort of political set of values was very important, because the only other place I'd ever seen people try to consciously live their values in the United States was within religious movements.
Okay. This is a very different movement, of course, and we're not really here to talk about religious movements, but I'm sure they have some relevance in terms of the development of communication. And, you know, the bigger quest, particularly as I think back on what Chile represented to the idea of emancipation, which has been part of a narrative within media theory for a long time. The idea of how communication actually gives you the information and the knowledge whereby you can move on to become free of the bounds and the limitations of society. But enough of that. Let's talk about how that experience then perhaps determined your career and your interest in media theory and what were you doing back in Boston.
Well, coming back from that level of sort of political engagement in communication to the U.S. was not easy, because I started realizing how very narrow U.S. media systems, how very narrow the content was, that we had such a mass media here and so much presence, and yet there was so little information. So I would come back and talk about situations in Latin America, and my mother would say to me, "Charlotte, I think you must be mistaken. I haven't seen that on the news. Surely you're wrong. You just have to be wrong." So at the same time, I was working in a position where I was seeing in Boston a number of African American residents be positively railroaded in situations, and yet have no credibility, because people would believe that surely a black man had done whatever the particular crime charged was. So I became very interested, and Boston busing was breaking open, so that there was a lot of overt racial tension.
Right.
And
That's 1974, I think.
1974, 1975. So after the coup in Chile. So it was just, the whole situation, it was very hard to figure out how you actually get people to talk to one another in such fraught conditions. And I became part of a community newspaper movement. So I still wasn't I wasn't doing academic work yet around theory. A whole series of community newspapers grew up. Dorchester Community News, Brighton Community News. I was part of that movement. WILD, which was an African American radio station, became very important. So there was a whole series of grassroots communication systems that started to develop where local people had a lot more control of the media, but they tended to be very localist in their content.
So just let me interrupt you and ask you if there seemed to be much of a direct relationship between what you'd seen work in Chile and how that knowledge was transferred into local communities in Boston. Was there any sense that there was a connection?
No. At that point, it was very clear to me. We had sort of, to the extent that you wanted to talk about a left in the United States that would have a conscious discussion of communication theory or media theory, or have an intentionality about what it was doing politically. The political parties we had obviously were Democrat and Republican, and their notion of how you use media was quite narrow. It was, how can I get my candidate on the 6 o'clock news?
Right.
To the extent
Still might be the case.
more or less. There were a number of student activists from the civil rights movement or the anti-war movement or the student movement who were very effective in getting their issues into the media, but they were seen as charismatic. It was like, oh, Michael Ansara is charismatic. Anything he touches, he's all over the media. So it wasn't what my next insight was, that compared to Latin America, here it was being fetishized as some sort of personal skill, whereas in a situation where there had been conscious, intentional understanding of communication as the connective tissue of building movements, there had been a whole different approach, and it had been much more democratic. You were dependent on being able to woo that charismatic person to your cause. So I became very interested in, well, what actually happens in this black box where the charismatic person pushes the right buttons such that media comes out the other side. And it was at that point that I decided to go to the university and started talking with people who were studying media. So that was the transition point where I had deep roots in a number of social movements, both nationally and internationally and locally. And we had a theoretical question: what happens in that black box? And it was my job to go find the answer. And I had the skills to go do that. So, and I wasn't a very good organizer, so off they sent me.
And in Boston at that time, were there a number of people who were asking similar questions and kind of creating a groundswell of academic and other research interests?
I think a number of intellectuals were trying to come to grips with the issue of how do social movements communicate, and how do people who are invested in egalitarian societies sort of know each other and share things and actually extend conversations. But I don't think many of us were thinking of it yet as media theory or communication theory. And that's in part the legacy of elite universities not having communication departments, so that to the extent that we started thinking about this, we tended to be in the social sciences. UMass Amherst is maybe an exception. It had a strong communication program. And some of around that time, by now it's not mid-1970s, it's mid-1980s. And Kevin Carnegie, who joined us, was trained at UMass Amherst. So we started having conversations among social scientists, political scientists, sociologists, communication scholars, all of whom were interested in figuring out, when movements succeed, how do they understand how they're communicating? And when movements don't succeed, to what extent is it a misunderstanding of opportunities at a particular conjuncture, social conjuncture, or how much is it lack of understanding of effective communication strategies, and how the role of communication in a social movement actually became something we consciously shaped as a question. It hadn't been a question before that. It was sort of, even when I started trying to figure this out, it was more of that, oh, here's the black box. It wasn't, to me, it wasn't, is it really a black box? It was like, I want to know what the buttons are in the black box. So I was still thinking inside the box in a way.
And what is particularly relevant, I suppose, to our project to think about media theory is the idea of putting media theory into a university context, to see the universities in this city mobilising around theory or mobilising around media and communication in a way that connected with the kind of work that you'd been doing. That seems to me to have been quite a rapid transition, as opposed to the more traditional notions of media theory that came out of maybe the Frankfurt School, which was the study of propaganda and how to avoid the abuses of media by propaganda, because of those folk who came from Frankfurt School, who were Jewish, who had seen what the Nazis and the fascists had done. That was a very different trajectory, it seemed to me, to be to what you're talking about. So how did the work that you were bringing, social movements and theorising what was trying to, and understanding what was happening inside that black box, how did that move into the universities? Who was prepared to take it up? Or is that something that's still too difficult for us to understand in terms of institutional histories?
Right. The idea that social movements were not spontaneous sort of crowds, but that they were rational actors pressing on social institutions, was itself novel at the time in the 1970s. So I was fortunate enough to land. I was recruited to teach at UMass Boston, University of Massachusetts Boston, in the College of Public and Community Service. And there were a number of people who also shared the understanding that music and art and theater and all forms of communication, which had exploded during the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the student movement, were essential to building the kind of new life, new communities that we wanted. Rebe Gallifrowlo was one of them. Marie Kennedy, who was an architect and was one of the 2 people fired at Harvard during the student strike, when she and Chester Hartman, her colleague, opened up the School of Design for people to develop posters and develop student propaganda for the protest movements. A number of people who couldn't imagine separating communication and music and visual images from social change were all at UMass Boston at the time. So that was one central place. And then they put me in touch with William Gampson, who was a social movement scholar, who came out of the teach-in movement and had been active himself in the anti-nuclear and anti-war movements over several generations. And he was open to the idea of developing a different kind of social change program. So we started from there, but it wasn't we had a different sense of what a university was. We had a sense that we were intellectual workers, and we were incredibly honored and privileged to be given the opportunity to use our brains to help our brothers and sisters who were working physically harder jobs than ours, and that we were to march into the libraries and march into the classrooms and pound the doors of anyone who knew more than we did, squeeze everything we could out, distill it into something that was legible or understandable language, and bring it home.
Right.
So that the university was a service to be provided to a society. It was not something separate.
Sure.
And so when I went into the university, I wasn't expecting it to be a home. I wasn't expecting to stay there. I was a girl on a mission, and I had to get home.
Well, it's good that you found a home, and we should talk about the home in the few minutes that are remaining to us. Talk about the home that you have, as it were, co-jointly with William Gampson at Boston College.
And Kevin Carrigy.
And Kevin Carrigy, and the MRAP, and you can tell us what MRAP stands for, and then explain how MRAP is connected to the research and activism associated with social movements.
Well, Bill and I originally, in 1985 or so, after we had been talking for about 2 years, founded a group that would be a weekly breakfast group at first. That was our first notion. And the whole purpose was to read social movement theory and media theory and try out projects and try to write about movements and communication, and be able to share with each other our works in progress. And it was very modest in it's very modest, except for the fact to do that in a disciplined fashion week after week for 25 years, which we've done now, has its impact. And it gave me an opportunity to start reading widely social movement theories from other places. So that's when I started reading people from Leicester and Stuart Hall and Williams and all the British and French and Italian theorists, as well as getting reconnected with some Latin American communication theorists.
Right.
So that became a venue from which I could both distill classic theory, if you will, and do practical work. And by forming ourselves as a small and very, very modest group, we then were able to start going out to unions systematically, to community-based organizations, and we essentially mapped the area of Boston and started defining who were the core constituencies who we felt needed and would benefit from having more access to democratic communication systems. And we approached people and we started a media fellows programs. And we worked with foundations till we got a minimal amount of support so that we could run a program for several years to actually help community groups not have to leave their community to get training, but for a staff person and a board member or an activist in an organization to be able to come on Saturdays and be paid to get training in basic communication, and then bring that back to start thinking about communication strategically in their organization. And then for us, Bill enjoyed it for different reasons that I did, but it actually gave us a situation to actually watch people who think about communicating with within movements all the time as they got the theory, as they played with it. How did they use it, and where did they get stuck?
Right. So was there a single theory that was driving this group, MRAP, or was it more just a sort of general interdisciplinary research focus with an activist bent?
I would say it's primarily the latter. I mean, Freire and Latin American communication theory was really, really important. You know, Williams, Raymond Williams was really important
so it's the whole
in
cultural
terms
studies
of
field.
Cultural studies and also sort of adult education emphasis.
Right, yeah.
So, I mean, they, off the top of my head, those would be, practice theory was very important. So, they would be the centers from which we started.
Action theory, I suppose, became part of it, or was it a different orientation?
Action theory was a little more empiricist than we were,
Right.
and I think we were more seeing the actual, we were much more, I think social construction theory was very important to Bill. I think we saw more that the actual doing of the work, as opposed to action theory, we were helping people develop strategies to do more sort of action-oriented things. But we saw the communication that was happening among the groups and with us as a use value in and of itself, so that it wasn't narrowly action theory, I don't think, in its classic classic sense.
So as you think back over the years that you've been involved with MRAP and social movements, what would you say have been the achievements or the contribution that you've made to media theory and media practice in this city?
Well, when we started, groups weren't even thinking, groups did not, for the most part, did not even have access to, they had not even intentionally said to themselves, media is something about which you can reflect critically. So it was news for me at the time. Chomsky actually came to my dormitory when I was an undergraduate, and he was a skinny little guy. And he sat on a piano bench, and he had a huge stack of New York Timeses next to him. And he said essentially, I'll show you how to read the New York Times. And he took them up one by one and would read a pre-selected segment and set it on the other side of the piano bench. So by the time he had shifted his pile, you saw how he reinterpreted the narrative of what the New York Times said about the Vietnam War, without having to say much commentary. And I was floored. I just adored that. Taking that same idea, when I started the Media Fellows, I would bring a newspaper and even saying to people, this is the front page, this is above the fold, this is below the fold, this is the Metro section. These are column inches. This is where the editor puts the name of this picture. This is a different person who puts up this banner headline. This is how it's constructed. Let's look at how this probably happened. Let's look at a storyboard. Let's look at how this story happens over 4 days. Look how in domestic violence you can always see that by day 4 the narrative has changed. All that was news to people. So
Right.
actually helping people become conscious, critical consumers where they actually felt control over words
Yes.
was huge, because organizing in the United States is an oral tradition. It's not even as much a written theory tradition as it is in Latin America.
Right.
So,
Gotcha.
I mean, I think actually getting people to, that was in the beginning, even telling people, think about the fact that radio is different from TV. Nobody had actually,
Right.
it's second nature, but nobody had actually said that to
Yeah.
most of the movement.
And it's
activists.
fascinating now as we come to the end of this interview to think about the incredible amount of energy that's embodied in this city. The number of people who do media in Boston and who probably take for granted many of the views and theories that have been promulgated partly by people like you and those others in media theory and the university sector generally, that have been able to say, well, here we can do some things that are very different in terms of understanding the social world, the world we inhabit, and bring about some change.
Well, I think it's important you're emphasizing the theory, because we're a very pragmatic society, and the theory has stayed the same throughout the 30 or 40 years we've been doing this. What hasn't changed, what's constantly changing, is the technology, and people are faddish about the technology, so that in Boston activism, and I think U.S. activism in general, there's still a tendency to go for the new fad technology, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. People think they're cutting edge because they have the new technology, without really understanding that both the theoretical continuity and the theoretical change that's going on.
Great. Well, I think that's pretty much going to sum up where we've come from in this wonderful historical journey you've taken us on. And thank you very much for being here, and thank you for contributing so much to Boston media theory, you and the others in MRAP in particular, the last, 25 years?
Yeah, at least.
So Dr. Charlotte Ryan, UMass Lowell, Department of Sociology.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it, and good evening.